7 minutes later, another week later, today, 4 days later, limited time only again, previously again, meanwhile, at the robot line. Later, at today very boring then approximately 1 million, zillion, jillion, dillion, cotillion, paranoia, billion years later. 7 weeks later, 9 weeks later, many days later, 4 hours later, 1 hour and 39 minutes later. Meanwhile, 9 books later, happy second anniversary. 12 months later,
Sometime later.
9 unbearable hours later, you win the idea. Several hours later,
Approximately 9 minutes later. Later that tomorrow. 7 very boring days later. 3 minutes later. Many moments later. A few weeks later.
a few months later,
7 hours and 7 weeks later.
25 years later, 11 hours later, the next Friday, 6 to 8 hours later, 8 to 12 minutes later, 3 to 5.5 moments later, several scary minutes later, a little longer than a few weeks later, the next week, 4 minutes later, several tic-tacs later, a little longer than a few seconds later, several weeks later, the following Monday, 9 more days later, several years later, a few flowers later, several weekends later, a today very boring then approximately 3 eternities later, after Doris fell asleep. A little longer than a few inches later. 3 minutes later, more hours later, a few moments later, 5 weeks later, the next night, a little longer than a few pants later, 4 to 6 minutes later, after Doris fell asleep. Day 5, day 6, day 7, 7 to 9 hours later, 9 to 11 months later, 6.5 minutes later, a little longer than a few days later, 2000 hours later, 8.5 inches later, 35 weeks later, 4 seconds later, 5 seconds later,
15 seconds later. 40 inventions later. A ton of weeks later. Many weeks later. 200 minutes later. Many unbearable minutes later. 60 minutes later. 4,000 centuries later. 2 minutes earlier. Meanwhile, when it's still going.
Meanwhile, still 16 hours later, 9 paranoia-filled minutes later, 13 minutes later, 67 seconds later, the following Monday, a little longer than a few months later, 20 days later, 7:20 a.m. 5 centuries later, 6 decades later, a few centuries later, the next day, 100 minutes later, 7 seconds later, a few decades later. Meanwhile, that same weeks. Meanwhile, that evening. Approximately 17 seconds later. Meanwhile, that night. 70 months later. 1 hour of making a new school later. 74 seconds later. Later, at the Krusty Krab. 23 minutes later. Many centuries later. 9 decades later. 500 minutes later. 6 minutes later. After Doris fell asleep. 14 months later. Many attempts to fix the house later. Day after tomorrow. 1 month later. 15 months later. Several long weeks later. Many dots later. 1 week later. 2 months later. 6 days later, 5,000 crazy months later, 90,000 years later, a few angry moments later, 7:30 p.m., 86 days later, the very next day, many decades later, 2 days later, many unbearable minutes later, a few moments later, 95 days later, 9 months later, 2 hours later, 85 seconds later, 1 week later, 45 minutes later, 1 hour later, 8 minutes later, 2 months later, 6 plates later, 8 seconds later, many musical notes later,